I started my new job in the old hospital with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, a sense of stepping into a place with decades of history and whispered legends. The building itself was a relic of a bygone era, its corridors and patient rooms steeped in the muted glow of yellowed light and the hum of antiquated machinery. At first, everything felt normal. The steady rhythm of day-to-day tasks, the reassuring routine of patient check-ins, and the small, friendly nods exchanged with colleagues who had, for years, come to accept the building's peculiarities as part of its charm. But soon little things began to catch my attention. It started with subtle shifts, a chair slightly out of place here, a window that seemed to reflect an angle I didn't remember there before, and quiet messages scrawled in what looked like faded ink on the walls near the nurse's station. I assumed these were the product of an overactive imagination or the wear of time on a building with many stories. Yet the sensation that something was off never left me. One evening, after a particularly long shift, I walked briskly through the main corridor on my way to the staff break room when I noticed that the familiar pattern of wall art had been replaced overnight by new paintings. Ominous portraits of stern-faced figures whose eyes seemed to follow me. At first, I dismissed it as a rearrangement by the maintenance crew, but the images were so unsettling that I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Over the next few days, the inexplicable alterations multiplied. I'd leave a supply closet with one layout and return to find the room inexplicably reconfigured. The medical cabinets shifted and patient files mysteriously misplaced. The quiet whispers of my colleagues, half laughs and murmured excuses, did little to allay my growing anxiety. One afternoon, while delivering medication to a ward I'd traversed 100 times, I saw a fleeting reflection in a window, a figure standing directly behind me, vanishing the moment I spun around. I chalked it up to fatigue and a trick of the light, but a persistent sense of dread crept in with every step I took. Then came the notes. I discovered a small piece of paper taped to my locker that read, "You are not alone here." Another note, left on a counter in the staff room, simply stated, "They see everything." I couldn't imagine who might be behind such cryptic warnings. When I asked, my co-workers exchanged uneasy glances and quickly changed the subject, as if afraid to acknowledge the unspoken terror that was permeating our daily lives. The hospital's layout began to betray itself in ways that defied logic. Doors that once led to well-known storage rooms now opened into unfamiliar, dimly lit corridors. I found myself wandering the halls late at night, trying desperately to retrace my steps, only to discover that each passageway seemed to have been subtly altered since my last visit. One such night, the sound of a faint, almost imperceptible whisper lured me toward a door I didn't recognize, a door that, instead of a handle, had a large, tarnished mirror embedded in its frame. Unable to resist, I reached out and brushed my fingers against the cool, reflective surface. In that instant, my vision flooded with fragmented images, endless hallways stretching into darkness, patient rooms filled with ghostly figures, and a series of doors that led to nowhere. I pulled my hand away as if burned, and the images faded, leaving only an overwhelming sense of despair and disorientation. It wasn't long before I began to suspect that I was not simply encountering random disturbances, but that the hospital itself was shifting around me, as if caught in a loop or some alternate reality where time and space had lost their meaning. I started to piece together hints from old documents tucked away in forgotten drawers, files that detailed a catastrophic fire in a wing of the hospital many years ago, an event that had left behind more than just charred remnants. Rumors circulated of lost souls, patients and staff who never truly left, their restless energies forever bound to the building's warped corridors. My nightmares became inescapable, filled with the disquieting sound of distant, echoing footsteps and the relentless ticking of clocks that never seemed to keep time. Each morning I awoke with a lingering fear that the hospital had somehow rearranged itself during the night. I began to find personal items misplaced in inexplicable locations, a stethoscope on a shelf in a room I didn't recognize, a personal note scrawled in my handwriting left on a counter that I was certain I had never written. As these changes mounted, I sought solace in the few confidants among my colleagues, only to find that they too had experienced bizarre, unaccountable shifts in their surroundings. One of them, an older nurse with decades of service, confided in hushed tones that the building had always been unpredictable, that its architecture was as fluid as its past, and that sometimes the hospital seemed to breathe, its corridors expanding and contracting in response to some unseen force. The final straw came on a rain-soaked evening when I resolved, in a moment of desperate clarity, to leave the building altogether. I navigated the winding hallways toward what I believed was the exit, only to find myself inexplicably back at the very corridor where I had started. A corridor that now bore strange symbols etched into the walls, symbols that pulsed with an eerie, unworldly light. Panic seized me as I realized that every attempt to escape only deepened my entanglement within this living labyrinth. Doors materialized where there had been none, and each new passage led me deeper into a maze of shifting realities. In that moment of paralyzing terror, I understood with bone-deep clarity that I wasn't merely a victim of a haunted hospital's caprices. I was trapped in an endless, nightmarish cycle, a closed loop where each step forward only served to confirm the inescapable truth that the hospital was not a static place, but a sentient, ever-changing entity. I pounded on doors and screamed for help, but my voice was absorbed by the oppressive silence of a reality that had long since lost its grip on normalcy. Now, as I write these words in a desperate bid to preserve what little of my sanity remains, I am convinced that the hospital exists beyond the boundaries of conventional time and space, a shifting monument to despair that ensnares those who dare to seek refuge within its walls. I have come to accept that I may never find a way out, that each day is but a repeat of the last, a relentless, unyielding cycle of disorientation and dread. I share my story not for sympathy, but as a warning. If you ever find yourself within those decaying corridors, remember that the place is alive, and its changes are not merely tricks of the light or figments of an overtaxed imagination. They are the manifestations of a reality that defies logic, a reality in which you, too, may one day find yourself hopelessly trapped, wandering an endless maze of shifting rooms and memories, forever searching for an exit that may not exist. It started on an ordinary Tuesday morning when I arrived at the hospital for a routine checkup following a minor accident. A moment I'd come to expect would be as clinical and predictable as any other visit. I wasn't anxious about being at St. Bartholomew's. I'd been here before and knew its corridors, the sterile hum of fluorescent lights, and the muted bustle of nurses and doctors going about their shifts. Yet that morning, as I fumbled with my bag at the reception desk, I discovered that my wallet was missing. It was a small, seemingly insignificant inconvenience, one I initially attributed to the chaos of my hurried departure. But as I retraced my steps along the polished floors, the incident felt strangely off, as if it were the first thread in a tapestry of events that would soon unravel. The receptionist, a kindly woman with eyes that, for a moment, seemed to reflect my own worry, offered a perfunctory apology and directed me to wait in the lounge. I couldn't shake the sensation that I'd been here before in exactly the same way, that some detail was missing from my memory even as I experienced it. At first, it was just a fleeting thought, a misfiring moment in an otherwise routine day. However, as I sat waiting, small oddities began to accumulate. A nurse passing by greeted me warmly with a name that wasn't mine, then quickly backtracked as though she had realized the mistake. A doctor I encountered in the hallway paused mid-conversation, only to continue as if nothing had happened, leaving me to wonder if I'd spoken aloud thoughts I shouldn't have. I watched as familiar faces, staff I'd known for years, exchanged glances that flickered with something like recognition, then immediately shifted into blank neutrality. The hospital itself seemed to morph subtly with every turn. The sterile white walls appeared to darken and lighten as I walked, and corridors I was sure I had passed before now branched unexpectedly into new, unrecognizable passageways. When I finally found a moment alone in a quiet corner, I checked my watch. It was almost as if time itself was slipping. Minutes bled into each other in a way that defied logic, and I began to wonder whether I was even living in the present or merely witnessing the reassembly of a narrative I no longer controlled. My growing unease came to a head when I was ushered into a small, nondescript room for what was supposed to be a routine procedure. The nurse assigned to take my vital signs kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes flickering with a mix of urgency and uncertainty. "Just relax," she murmured, but in the reflective surface of the monitoring equipment, I caught a glimpse of another figure standing right behind her, a shadow that vanished the instant I turned to confirm its presence. I tried to shake off the sensation, chalking it up to my nerves, yet each subsequent encounter left me more disoriented. At the radiology department, when I asked to see my x-rays, the technician's hands trembled as he hurriedly turned off the lights. His whispered apology sounded rehearsed, as if he were reciting lines from a script he'd memorized and then abandoned. I pressed for answers, but each staff member I spoke to seemed to forget my questions almost immediately, their recollections dissolving into uncertainty. It wasn't long before I began noticing an even stranger phenomenon. Entire conversations would be forgotten in the span of moments. A doctor's reassuring words one minute would vanish from his memory the next, leaving behind a blank stare that made me feel like an intrusion in a space where I was no longer welcome. I recall distinctly sitting in the waiting room when a fellow patient, whose face alternated between expressions of fear and inexplicable familiarity, addressed me as if we were lifelong friends. When I inquired about our previous conversation, her eyes clouded over and she simply smiled before moving on as if our interaction had never occurred. I felt increasingly detached, as if I were a bystander in my own life, trapped in a loop of half-remembered events and fleeting interactions that left no trace once they passed. In the quiet moments before dusk, I found refuge in a dimly lit corner near the nurse's station, feverishly scribbling down details that I desperately hoped would anchor me to some semblance of reality. Yet even my notes betrayed me. Words that I had written one moment would reappear altered or omitted entirely, as if someone or something were editing my memories in real time. The final, most unnerving incident occurred when I was informed that my missing wallet had been found in a locked drawer in the administrative office, a place I had no recollection of entering. Its presence was both a relief and a new source of dread. Every item inside was exactly as I'd left it, yet the entire recovery felt orchestrated, as though my life were a series of carefully constructed events designed to disorient me. I left the hospital that night with a heavy heart and an even heavier sense of unreality. In the days that followed, I attempted to recount my experiences to friends and family, only to be met with blank stares and polite dismissals. They insisted that I was overreacting, that the stress of the accident must have muddled my thoughts. But every time I closed my eyes, I was confronted with the image of shifting corridors, forgotten conversations, and faces that morphed before my eyes. I began to wonder if I had become trapped in a place where reality was fluid, where the past, present, and future were rewritten by forces beyond my control. Now, as I sit alone in my quiet apartment, I find myself questioning every facet of that day at the hospital. Am I losing my grip on sanity? Or was there truly something insidious at work behind the sterile facade of St. Bartholomew's? The unanswered questions loom large, and I can't shake the feeling that the hospital exists not just as a building, but as a labyrinth of fractured time and memories, a place where the rules of normalcy are constantly rewritten. Even as I write these words, I am haunted by the possibility that recalling them might set off another chain of inexplicable events, erasing parts of my past or rewriting my future. I have no definitive answers, only a lingering, unsettling doubt about whether I am the architect of my own disintegration or merely a pawn in a narrative controlled by something far more elusive and terrifying than I can comprehend. I first noticed him on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday afternoon in the hospital cafeteria, a quiet space with two bright fluorescent lights and the soft murmur of anxious conversations. I was waiting for my routine scan results after a minor procedure when I saw him sitting alone at a corner table, his expression calm and unreadable, as if he were contemplating the meaning of every moment around him. At first, I chalked it up to coincidence. After all, hospitals attract a wide array of visitors and patients, and his presence seemed as innocuous as anyone else's. Yet as the days passed, a subtle disquiet began to build inside me. I started noticing him elsewhere, a fleeting glimpse in the reflection of a polished corridor mirror, the sight of him casually leaning against the reception desk when I was checking in, or standing silently by the exit just as I was about to leave. Each encounter was brief, almost accidental, but the pattern was unmistakable, and my mind began to churn with uneasy questions. Who was he? And why did he seem to be everywhere I went? At first, his appearances were so transient that I almost convinced myself it was mere chance, a case of my nerves playing tricks on me during a time of vulnerability. I had been grappling with my own anxieties following the operation, and the sterile, clinical environment of the hospital often left me feeling exposed and alone. But then, during one of my routine blood tests, he approached me in a manner that defied explanation. Standing close by in the cramped waiting area, he initiated a conversation with an ease that was both disarming and unnerving. His voice was soft, and his words were peppered with harmless observations about the weather and the interminable wait. Yet there was an undercurrent in his tone that made it clear he was probing for more than just small talk. Despite the cordiality of the exchange, a cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach as I felt the weight of his gaze lingering far too intently on me. In the following weeks, his presence became a persistent specter. I found him in the hospital corridor where I least expected him, as if he knew my every step. On one occasion, after a particularly stressful consultation with my doctor, I stepped into the hospital garden for a moment of solace, only to see him at the far end of the pathway, watching me silently from beneath a weeping willow. When I attempted to bring up the oddity with a nurse, she only smiled politely and suggested that perhaps my mind was playing tricks on me, fueled by anxiety and the sterile monotony of hospital life. Yet, as I continued my visits, each appointment, each restless night spent in the hospital's transient waiting rooms, he reappeared, sometimes in a casual conversation, sometimes in a fleeting glance, and always with an air of unnerving normalcy. Every encounter left me oscillating between the rational and the paranoid. I would try to convince myself that he was simply another patient or perhaps a concerned volunteer trying to offer comfort in his own reserved way. But the recurring pattern of his appearances, the way he seemed to materialize in the exact moments when I felt most vulnerable, began to erode my sense of security. I started to scrutinize every face in the crowded hallways, every idle bystander in the hospital lobby, desperate to find confirmation that my mind wasn't constructing an elaborate illusion. Instead, I found myself trapped in a loop of hyper-awareness, every creak in the floor and every whisper of footsteps fueling my mounting paranoia. Then came the day that shattered whatever fragile equilibrium I had managed to maintain. I was in the hospital's waiting area, anxiously clutching the results of a particularly nerve-wracking test, when I noticed an unmarked envelope placed conspicuously on the bench where I had been sitting. My heart pounded as I recognized the handwriting on the envelope, a style identical to the neat script I had once seen him casually jotting down notes on a clipboard during one of our brief interactions. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope to find a single, cryptic sentence. "I know your fears, and they are not secret." The message, stark and unadorned, sent a chill racing down my spine, as if someone had deliberately invaded the most private recesses of my mind. In that moment, the hospital's sterile walls seemed to close in around me, transforming the once familiar environment into a labyrinth of dread and suspicion. As days turned into sleepless nights filled with vivid, unsettling dreams, my emotional state began to crumble. I found myself questioning every benign interaction, every incidental meeting, wondering if I had inadvertently stepped into the center of a meticulously crafted plan. The hospital, a place I had once associated with healing and care, now felt like a stage set for an elaborate performance. One in which I was the unwilling protagonist and his calm, inscrutable presence was the ominous overture to a script I had no control over. I tried to seek solace in the reassurances of staff and friends, but their well-meaning platitudes only deepened the void of isolation I felt. Every smile, every nod of encouragement was tinted with the lingering image of his unblinking eyes. I became increasingly preoccupied with the notion that my life was being orchestrated like a chess game, with each move calculated by an unseen hand. In the quiet moments between the relentless hum of hospital machinery and the muted chatter of other patients, I wrestled with the unsettling possibility that my every move was being monitored. I began keeping a detailed log of my encounters, documenting the time, place, and even the subtle nuances of his behavior. Yet, despite my efforts to impose a sense of order on the chaos of my thoughts, the log only reinforced my growing paranoia. The rational part of me insisted that coincidences were just that, random, unconnected events. But the emotional part of me, the part that had felt the cold weight of his gaze and the eerie precision of his timing, whispered a darker truth. That I was caught in the crosshairs of someone who had decided that my life was worth an obsessive, unsettling study. Now, as I sit here recounting these events with a trembling hand and a mind teetering on the edge of despair, I can no longer tell if these experiences are the product of a heightened state of anxiety or the deliberate actions of a stranger whose motives remain shrouded in mystery. The hospital, once a sanctuary of recovery, has become the backdrop for my slow descent into paranoia and helplessness. Every time I step into its sterile halls, I am reminded of that single, chilling message and the relentless, inexplicable presence of a man who seems to know far too much about my vulnerabilities. I am left to wonder, with a dread that refuses to subside, whether all of these unsettling encounters are nothing more than a series of coincidences born out of my overactive imagination, or if, in fact, someone is truly stalking me. I moved into the small apartment just a few blocks from St. Marguerite Hospital with the kind of cautious optimism one might have when starting a new chapter in life. I had recently taken a job as a night shift administrative assistant, and while the position was mundane on its surface, I was eager to embrace the routine of it all, until I began noticing that the hospital's sterile corridors and hushed whispers carried secrets far darker than I could have imagined. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday. I was finishing up some paperwork in a quiet corner of the office when I caught sight of a shadow flitting past the frosted glass door of an unused storage room. I told myself it was nothing more than a trick of the light, a mere anomaly in an otherwise unremarkable evening. But as the days went by, that small moment of unease grew into a persistent, nagging sensation that something was amiss. One late night, while reviewing old patient records, I discovered several files that didn't belong in our current database. There was a series of handwritten notes dated back to the early 1960s, chronicling the case of a woman named Eileen who, according to our records, had died decades ago. Yet, inexplicably, her name kept reappearing in modern logs, tucked away among new entries as if her presence were a routine, albeit hidden, part of the hospital's operations. My inquiries with colleagues were met with dismissive remarks and tired smiles. Old records always resurface, one nurse said, while another insisted that I must have misfiled something. But as a person who prided myself on logic and attention to detail, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a more sinister explanation behind these inconsistencies. One particularly stormy night, when a power outage plunged much of the hospital into a dim, eerie glow from emergency lights, I found myself wandering a seldom-used corridor. The walls, lined with outdated paintings whose subjects seemed to track my every movement, whispered in the hum of flickering bulbs. I heard footsteps echoing in the distance, not matching my own measured pace. Drawn by a mixture of dread and an insatiable need to understand, I followed the sound to a door marked record storage. Inside, amidst disordered filing cabinets and scattered documents, I unearthed charts filled with indecipherable notes and repeated entries for Eileen. The handwriting shifted subtly between entries, as if multiple unseen hands had added their own contributions. It was a puzzle that defied logic, and yet each new piece only deepened the mystery. Soon, my nights became punctuated by inexplicable occurrences. I started recording low whispers in the empty hallways and capturing grainy photos of shadowy figures that seemed to dissolve as soon as I tried to focus on them. On one occasion, I photographed what appeared to be a figure in a tattered hospital gown standing at the end of a corridor. The face was obscured by darkness, but the mere sight sent shivers down my spine. When I showed the photo to a coworker, his only reaction was to caution me against overworking myself, insisting that fatigue often conjured illusions in the mind of someone alone with their thoughts. But the rational part of me struggled to dismiss the evidence. I began piecing together every odd occurrence. The spontaneous flickering of lights in the dead of night, rooms that were inexplicably empty yet still exuded a sense of recent use, and the persistent reappearance of the same name in records that should have been long closed. The hospital, with its clean facade and methodical routine, seemed to harbor a hidden layer of history, a layer that was now intruding into the present with relentless determination. My curiosity soon turned into obsession. I scoured archive files, talked discreetly with older staff members, and even ventured into parts of the building that were supposedly sealed off after renovations. I learned murmurs of a forgotten wing where experimental treatments were once conducted and where, according to whispered rumors, patients had vanished without a trace. Each snippet of information only led to more questions. Who was Eileen really, and why did her name persist as if she were still among the living? What dark chapter of the hospital's past had been buried so deeply that even official records hesitated to acknowledge it? Despite my efforts, every attempt to piece together a coherent explanation was met with resistance from both the institution and my own faltering sanity. One night, after a long shift filled with these disconcerting discoveries, I received an anonymous text message that simply read, "Return." The message arrived on my personal phone, far removed from the hospital's secure network, and it sent a chill down my spine that no amount of logical reasoning could dispel. I tried to dismiss it as a cruel prank, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the hospital itself was calling me back, urging me to confront secrets that were never meant to be unearthed. As I write this, I sit in my modest apartment, the soft hum of the city a distant echo compared to the palpable dread that has taken root in my mind. I have compiled photographs, audio recordings, and scanned documents that seem to prove there is something inexplicably wrong within the walls of St. Marguerite Hospital. But when I try to share my findings with anyone, I'm met with polite skepticism or outright dismissal. The rational voices tell me that fatigue, stress, and the human mind's propensity for pattern recognition are all to blame. And yet, every night, as the hospital's exterior lights dim and the building settles into a silence that feels almost alive, I can't help but wonder if I've stumbled upon something far bigger and far more terrifying than a series of administrative errors or misfiled records. Now, with that single word still glowing on my phone and the weight of unanswered questions pressing in from all sides, I find myself at a crossroads. Should I heed the silent summons of a place that seems to straddle the line between reality and something beyond our understanding? Or do I resign myself to a life shadowed by inexplicable events, forever haunted by a truth that refuses to be rationalized away? I do not have the answers, and perhaps I never will, but I do know that the hospital's secrets continue to whisper in the darkness, waiting for the moment when someone dares to listen.